the challenge. That's the challenge of climate action, right? Because it needs the requirement, it needs a cooperation and a lot of coordination between different disciplines. So I'm very happy to speak. So I'm coming from the finance background. CFNT is quite new. So we're set up officially only last year in Thailand. Right now we have about 8 people, including 5 researchers with a background in finance. So we want to just center all of our research on how to propel Thailand's financial sector for more meaningful climate action. So some of our first research work has been on, for example, calculating the value of coal-fired power plants and fossil gas plants as stranded assets in Thailand. We are also right now looking at collecting information on climate finance flows. What are all the investments that go into either climate mitigation or climate adaptation in Thailand. And we hope to present the results in a few months. So if anyone is interested in our work, please feel free to go to our website. You can Google Climate Finance Network Thailand. We also have a kind of a membership initiative where you can sign up to receive news on what we're doing, also some member activities. Okay, so that's without further ado, let's get started. I think the why we are talking about climate finance, so essentially is driven by the urgency of climate action, right? And so as you all know, this is just a snapshot of the status of net zero goals in different countries in ASEAN. And if you notice, quite different countries have different years as a target. And Thailand, unfortunately, net zero target is the slowest in ASEAN. And why this is important for climate finance, because I think policy directives and government action play a big role in, determining how much and how fast private sector incentives are in investing in climate action. So countries with very clear policy directives and very clear transition plans and policies, for example, things like carbon taxes, which I would not go over today, but those kinds of policy initiatives have a big part in propelling the different transition of companies and also banks. And it's becoming fashionable, I think, while we are talking that banks, you notice banks and many companies already announced the different net zero goals, right? But the clarity and the seriousness, I guess, of their transition plans vastly differ. In Thailand, actually, in the next 7 days, one of the initiatives we are involved with will launch a case study on comparing climate disclosures of 6 big Thai banks, and we note a very wide divergence. But at the same time, no matter how urgent climate action is nowadays, and despite the different net zero goals, we can see some interesting developments that could be seen as opportunities. So most recently, the world had a COP29 meeting. And this year it will be COP30, which is an important year because COP30 is a year that every country has to present more ambitious national goals, or what they call the NDCs, nationally determined contribution. So as I'm speaking, Thailand's, as well as any other government, I would believe in the world, is working on the NDC plan, how to raise our ambition for COP. So, but for COP29 is a pretty important year for climate finance because it's the first year where finally, after the developing countries ask the developed countries, right, for funding. Also in terms of climate justice, we say that we are still developing and the rich countries have been polluting the world way before us. We have been asking for clear targets for assistance and for climate finance from rich countries. Finally, there was a target agreed upon, which of course comes under criticism because some people say it's still far from the amount that we need for meaningful climate action. But regardless, it's the first time that the world agree on this number, 300 billion US per year from the developed countries by 2035. And so in Thailand, CFNT, my team has been speaking with the World Bank in Thailand and the ADB, the Asian Development Bank, and they are also, this number means they have to increase their assistance, their plans, they have to coordinate with each other quite a lot more. So I think this is an opportunity for us, for ASEAN. Also in terms of the carbon market agreement, we have a kind of agreement on the finalized carbon market this is a scheme under the Paris Agreement. Also, another interesting opportunity here, I think, in terms of the subsidies, because many academics and observers have said that one way to unlock capital that we need for climate finance is for the government to reduce the fossil subsidies, right? Because many countries around the world, including in Thailand, we spend quite a lot of public money, government budget on various kinds of subsidy for fossil fuel. And so logically, if you can reduce or get rid of these fossil subsidies, that means that money can be better spent on low carbon initiatives and helping communities transition and so on. So interestingly, at COP29, a few governments have already announced, so US, UK, Colombia, New Zealand joined a coalition that says they will start to phase out the fossil subsidies. Also, there are some interesting developments in terms of the alternative energies like hydrogen, which many people are watching, whether it can be a kind of replacement for fossil fuel or not. There's a hydrogen declaration. There's also a global energy storage and bridge pledge, which says that we need to increase global storage capacity quite a lot by 2030 and also refurbish a lot of grids worldwide, because existing grids basically only handle mostly fossil fuel. So in order to permit more renewable energy, because those are variable, what they call the variable renewable energy, they are intermittent, they cannot generate power all 24 hours. So we need to invest in smart grid solutions and a lot of the demand side solutions. So these are just some interesting quick takes from COP29 and I think that is paving the way towards COP30, hopefully with more concrete results. And of course, there are many kinds of things that we need finance to do, right? So essentially, you can divide the needs for funding into climate mitigation. So essentially, what we can do to reduce carbon emissions from different sectors. And then on the other hand, we know that climate change will impact a lot of people, especially the vulnerable communities. So how do we help them adapt? So at the same time, we also need climate adaptation activities. So I also want to point out a little later why generally it's much more difficult to raise financing for climate adaptation compared to climate mitigation. And increasingly, we also hear about some thoughts and some ideas on how we can structure projects that can have dual benefits. So they can be both climate mitigating and climate adapting, and how to structure projects that can meet many different needs at once. So among the kind of ideas that are being put forward, I think nature-based solution is one of the more interesting and promising ones, especially in the context of helping cities and urban settlements adapt to climate hazards. So I think this is just an example that I got from interestingly, this is from the IPCC, the UN Agency on Climate Change. So some of their reports also go into cities and nature-based solutions quite a little bit. So that's interesting to see. So let's go into a little bit of definition. So it's a little, maybe oh, by the way, if I go too fast, please also let me know. So there are two words that are kind of interrelated, but not the same. So one word is climate finance, and the other one is carbon finance. So if we start with climate finance, and I'm taking this from the UN FCCC, sort of the UN authority on this, it basically means any kind of financing, right? Whether it's at the local level, the national level, or transnational level. It could be public, it could be private, it could be the combination of public or private. So whatever kinds of financing that seek to support the mitigation or adaptation actions that will address climate change. So either it has to help with climate mitigation, so reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, or it has to help with climate adaptation, helping us adapt to the impacts of climate change. So essentially, this is already laid out in the convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. It actually has some clauses, some elements that talk about the climate justice aspect of climate finance also. So basically it says that, people with more resources should basically should give financial assistance to people or countries that are less endowed and more vulnerable. So there's an element, there's a kind of direction of the flows, right? So we're not expecting that developing countries will have to assist developed countries. It should be the other way around as much as we can. Climate finance is needed for mitigation because we need a lot of investments to significantly reduce emissions. And the difficulty in mitigation, so it's not only that we need to quickly and massively increase in investments in low carbon industries and activities, but at the same time we have to move money away from the high carbon, high emission activities. So you may start to hear this term transition finance being popped up. So transition finance basically just means any financing that's trying to move activity from brown, from high carbon to green, to low carbon activities. And at the same time, of course, we also need some money for adaptation because we need to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change. Carbon finance is a more kind of specific definition. So because in the international agreements, it makes room for the carbon market, right? So carbon emission allowances. So carbon finance means any kind of financial resources. It could be grants, subsidies, loans, or equity investments. So any kind of financial resources that's given to acquire greenhouse gas emission allowances. So basically, you can think of them as carbon rights or simply carbon. So if we put everything in perspective, you can see that mitigation finance is on the one side, adaptation finance is on the other side, and then carbon finance is kind of a subset of mitigation finance. So that's only addressed at the specific carbon rights or carbon emissions allowance. So of course, in countries like in Thailand, where we don't yet have mandatory carbon mechanisms, let's talk about carbon finance. So we only have voluntary carbon market at the moment. Okay, so another interesting aspect, I think, that will maybe come into play, or maybe you will hear more in the context of carbon finance, is this idea of loss and damages, right? And so a few COPs earlier, the world agreed to set up this fund called the Loss and Damages Fund. And essentially, this is meant to assist with countries that have clear loss and damages from climate change. So you can think of it as something that's connected to climate adaptation. So essentially, if you come up with a climate adaptation activity and you think that it can help, reduce some portion of the impact. So let's say it can reduce the climate adaptation funding can reduce 50% of the impact. The rest of the impact cannot be helped. So you have basically the loss or damage will happen. So that 50% could be liable to, or you could have access to this kind of loss and damage fund to pay for those loss and damages that happen as a kind of path that cannot be adapted. So I think that there's a potential here. It's still a kind of new concept, but I think as we move on this topic, there may be potential to structure it in a way that loss and damages is connected to climate adaptation, right? Because it's kind of basically what you do when you cannot adapt and damages happen anyway. Okay, and you can see that here, despite the fact that climate finance is actually increasing, but it's still not fast enough. So this is a number from CPI, the Climate Policy Initiative, which tracks climate finance worldwide. So essentially, you see that we need basically 5 times more investments in order to meet the about 7 trillion US that's needed. And 7 trillion is basically needed every year from now to 2030. This is to keep average temperature to 1.5 degrees, which is kind of dangerous because we may have reached that point already. Okay, and at the same time, so a lot of financiers and academics say that, well, okay, that number may look very big, right? How are we going to find 7 trillion US? So one way of looking at it is no matter how big the investment is needed, but if we don't do anything, so if we don't try to find funding and invest away from high carbon, there's going to be economic losses, right? So if the world continues on under the business as usual scenario, potentially the economic losses will be much higher than the investments required for climate finance. So in other words, one way to try to convince people to basically put up money for climate finance investment is to look at this aspect of loss avoidance, or we can say prevention cost, right? So essentially you say you should invest in climate finance, not because you may make more money, or it's going to basically make more profit. But if you don't invest, you're going to face the impact that's going to be damage. So the value of your damages could be a lot more than the investment that you need to spend, right? So that kind of rationale becomes important also at the corporate level, also at the community level or at the local level. So I think this is one thing that we can try to translate in different levels to build more incentive for climate finance, especially for adaptation. And there are many sources, as I mentioned, for climate finance. So it could be domestic public finance. It can come out of government budget, can come out of local government budget. It can be international public finance, like there's a UNFCCC mechanisms, as you've seen in COP29, they agreed on the kind of the global carbon market that's going to be set up under Article 6.2. But there are many multilateral institutions. There are many also bilateral institutions that work on this. Like in Thailand, we're familiar with GIZ, for example, from Germany, and IKI and Green Climate Fund, for example. And of course, private finance is also involved because companies themselves start to invest on climate mitigation or climate adaptation also. And also not to mention philanthropies and foundations, and also people that may be called venture philanthropies. So all of this I group under the name impact investors, because that's kind of the name that more recently the financial world is calling all of these people. And households, right? So people themselves also invest. So a lot of people may just decide that I want to put up rooftop solar on my house. So that's basically if you use your own money for that, that's you're investing in climate mitigation, for example. So it can come from all kinds of sources. So that's why tracking all of these sources could be challenging. And this is what it looks like in the world right now. So again, this is based on the CPI calculation. Because it's very difficult to track every single project, right? So not all projects will claim or will announce that this is a climate mitigation or climate adaptation. They also use some kind of proxy. So they calculate, for example, from the so for solar energy, they look at what is the total installed amount of solar energy, and then try to work back how much investment is needed for that much solar energy. So there's a combination of like direct data collection and also some methodology to calculate. But just you can see from this chart, so this is the latest year, we have the number for 1.3 trillion US on average. So you compare this number with the 7 trillion we need per year, right? That's why we need like 5 times more investment. And the vast majority of investment is into mitigation. And you can see East Asia and Pacific gets a pretty big chunk of all climate finance in the world. So it's about 584 billion US. Adaptation is a very tiny portion of, so out of 1.3 trillion US dollars, it's only 68 billion. It's very tiny amount is used for climate adaptation. Okay, so where do they go, right? So essentially, if you look at the breakdown of countries and region, East Asia and Pacific, the vast amounts of climate finance is actually domestic climate finance. So this is quite interesting. So basically that means the domestic banks and governments spend like way more, spend way more than the international finance in their countries. So this picture is very different. China is also similar, but you can see that the picture is quite different for Africa, for example, which is not going to be a surprise to anyone, right? But anyways, overwhelmingly domestic climate finance in our region. And one difficulty I would say is that, or one challenge in looking at this is that different kinds of players have different incentives and risk appetite, right? So even though you can say, well, many people or everybody should have an incentive to invest in climate finance because the problem is real, and then we're going to get more severe impact in the future. But that doesn't mean that they can easily decide to invest in the same thing with the same time horizon. So for example, the international donors, if you look at the first column, international donors and the major climate funds tend to be more on, they have some concessional loan or grant payment to pay, and they can look at the long term. And their risk appetite could be low to medium. And they just might want to come in to encourage more private sector to join. They just want to provide kind of the seed funding to attract some private players, right? At the other extreme, if you look at the last column, the intermediaries and civil society or impact investors, for example, they could be more interested in non-financial investment. They're the ones who implement the projects. They might want to combine the climate activities with the ongoing community development that they already work in. And they are in it for the long term. So they could be able to take more risk, for example, but they tend to be smaller maybe than the multinational donors and the bank. So different players have different appetites. For the local banks, typically they're quite conservative. They have very low risk appetite. So this is one challenge when some companies tell us that they want to they go to the bank and ask to finance some climate smart solutions or like climate adaptation, and a lot of times bank, if they're not familiar with it, they feel that it's not the right time to invest. So that's kind of one obstacle. So banks tend to finance the things that they already know very well and have like a proven track record, and they can calculate financial returns. Like for example, in Thailand now, it's easy for you to get a funding for solar rooftop if you are factories. If you go to the bank and say, I run a factory, I want to put solar on my factory, I want to do energy efficiency programs, it's quite easy to get loans because you can easily calculate the cost savings, right, from those activities, and that make the banks confident that you can pay back their loans, right? But for kind of the more long-term climate adaptation projects, it's more difficult. Okay. In terms of the capital market, so since right now is again, as you see, all kinds of players can join in the climate finance. At the same time, we see that more investors are also interested, right? So investors also want to support the kind of a transition that we need, a kind of climate action. And so right now we have a lot of different green and social and bonds and loans. So I'm going to try to explain the key differences between each of them, right? So the principles you see at the bottom of this slide are kind of the internationally accepted, or like some of the more popular principles for those instruments. And they are mostly announced by this association called the ICMA. So essentially it's the Association for Capital Markets, right? So on the left-hand side, you see the debt securities. So debt securities, it could be bonds or loans. So bonds is something you issue in the market. And then so the lenders are essentially anybody who buy your bonds, right? And they just have to pay interest on the bond. And then when it reaches maturity, you redeem the bond. For loan just means debt that you borrow directly from any bank. So that's essentially the difference between the bond and loan, but they are both debt securities, so debt instruments. So for green bonds, that means 100% of the proceeds. So if you want to raise money for green bond, you have to explain that total proceeds will be used for green project. So of course, there'll have to be a category of what classifies as green project. So similar for green loans, right? You go to a bank lends you green loan. That means you have to be able to explain that, what the money is used for is totally have to be green. For social bonds, have to be for social activities. For sustainable bonds, it's kind of the big word that could mean a combination of social and green activity. So that's what these bonds and loans mean, right? So essentially, the total proceeds you raise have to be for green or social projects only under the criteria. But for the sustainability linked bonds or loan, that's quite different. It's actually meant for companies that want to get involved, but they may not have specific project in mind, right? So let's say if I'm a company and I already do a lot of these like renewable energy and like climate investments, but I want to take advantage of this market. I want to have like favorable interest. I can ask for the bank for sustainability linked loans. So what the bank would do is set up some KPI with me. So my KPI could be that, okay, in 2 years, I'm gonna reduce my emission by 10%, right? And if I meet my KPI, then the bank will reduce interest for me. So that's basically sustainability linked just means KPI based loans or bonds. So, but the amount of proceeds I raise can be for anything. I can use the money I raise for working capital or to repay old debt. So that's a difference between the sustainability linked bonds and loans and the green social and sustainable bonds, right? Okay, I hope that's clear. And in Asia Pacific, especially in our region, it's becoming very popular. So you can see that there's a clear growth in the market, especially for green bonds. That's kind of the dominant part of the market. And overwhelmingly in ASEAN, the number one issuer is Singapore. And I think that they are really trying to cement their, I guess, reputation as a financial hub in ASEAN. So you can see that sustainability linked bonds are much lower compared to the green bond. That's like really dominant. And essentially, what are some of the key principles or themes when you look at these instruments? So there are basically 4 things that's involved, right? So first, you need to think about the sources of climate finance. Is it going to be you want to issue like a bond, you want to borrow a loan, or it could be some kind of grant money from international donors. So these could all have different incentives. And then who's going to be intermediary agency? So do you need intermediaries to arrange to put it all together? And what kinds of instruments you will use for this? And then once you raise the funds, how do you allocate and how do you use the funds, right? So the issue of MRV, the monitoring, reporting, and verification, is actually very important for green bonds or loans because for the normal like conventional bond, maybe the investor only has to buy the story you sell, right? Like, okay, you want to expand your project, you expand the business, and then the investor can just read your financial statements later, to see whether you make money or your profit is higher or not. But for the green bond, because it has to be for the specific, right, for the green criteria. So investors really want to know if you're really using the money to invest in green projects. That's why the monitoring and reporting is has to be a little bit more complicated in this sense. And so one way of greenwashing in this space that people raise is that when some companies they claim to they claim to come to the market and they want to issue green bonds, and then somebody find out later that the proceeds are not actually used for a green project at all. So this could be one way of greenwashing. And in terms of adaptation, there are a lot of I think challenges, as I mentioned earlier. So if you remember from that chart, adaptation is very tiny compared to mitigation, right? And although the cost of it is projected to increase. And mostly if you look at who's financing for adaptation, it's mostly still public actors. So it's basically governments, international donors, very, very little for private sector. So this is interesting because we say, well, climate change affects everybody. So business should actually be interested also, right? Because they have assets at risk, and they also face transition risk, and the investors also ask them more questions on what they do with climate change. It's part of the ESG, the environment, social, and governance kind of expectation, right? So why is it that private sector are not really investing in adaptation? And so there are basically three main reasons, right? So first of all, there's a perception that, well, there's no money to be made and it's too risky. Because as I mentioned earlier, if you invest in mitigation, like you say, okay, I'm gonna change to renewable energy, or I'm gonna change to energy efficient lighting, things like that. That has a kind of clear financial benefit, right? You can calculate savings from those investments, for example. And so that's an easier sell than adaptation, which depends on different climate scenarios. The impact that you project maybe happen in 10 years down the road, and it may not happen. There's a lot of risk. There's a lot of uncertainties, and not very clear, or maybe no financial returns, no direct returns, and a lot of benefits may accrue to the public, right? So this is one reason. The second reason, which is also related, is we can call it knowledge gaps, right? So very uncertain what we're going to get out of adaptation, lack of systematic measuring of impacts, which I think is a general problem, not just in Thailand, but in many countries also. And so for those of you who are working with communities, I think I encourage you that this is maybe one good place to start, right? Is to like systematically measure the impacts of climate change and the damages that's happening, so that when it comes to thinking about adaptation projects, you can easily use that number, as a kind of similar to what I mentioned about loss and damage, right? Any investment is worth it if we can help avoid that much damage. So we may not know that, what kind of adaptation projects will work, but we can, I think right now, try to get better idea of impacts of climate change on the communities and the public, right? And then there's also challenges to calculate returns on investment. How do I make informed investment decisions? What kind of, if I have to think about different climate scenarios, what scenarios do I use? So all of this is about information problems, knowledge gaps. And then lastly, I think the investment horizon and size is also one limitation also. So I'm sure a lot of you know more than me about the high impact adaptation project, right? Sometimes it takes time, and you invest now, and by the time you see the result, like you see that communities can really adapt. Or if it's about like in Thailand, we start to talk about disaster risk reduction and management. Those investments, if we do it today, maybe the result will take years from now, right? Because you need time for people to change their behavior and so on. So there's a long-term nature of this for many kinds of projects. So there's potentially very large upfront costs involved with the long payback time. And often the impactful projects are not big, right? They can be very small. So in Thailand, we hear stories of some very interesting community level adaptation projects that really help the community. But because the ticket size, the amount of investment is so small, it cannot take basically advantage of the global fund, for example, or the like international donors. So I think these kinds of projects need intermediaries or somebody to bundle and to combine the project into more investable size. So I think those are kind of some of the challenges, and you can see that they can kind of be addressed, but not very easy. Okay, so one solution that people start to talk about is they start to use this word de-risking, right? Because a lot of the challenges we see for private sector involve basically a lot of risk, a lot of uncertainties. So it makes them very hesitant. So solutions have to address those risks to make, especially if you want the private sector, like private banks involved, you need to ensure them that there's a way to manage or transfer those risks. So one way is what is now being called blended finance. So this is basically just means any kind of combination of public finance to basically unlock further private investment. So it could be like government guarantees, it could be like international bank guarantees, it could be co-financing, or some people start to use the word risk tolerant capital, meaning that I invest as a equity in a company, like a startup, and whatever loss happens, I absorb the loss first, and the equity holders that come after me. So other investors, they face less risk because I absorb the loss first as a first layer. So that is what's being called the risk tolerant capital. So it can absorb more risk. There's also this word called catalytic funding. The word I like the word because it's like it sounds exciting. Catalytic is like catalyst, something like that. But it's often public money that's meant to enable the development of innovation, some pilot proof of concept, right? So maybe because we need a lot more investment in general in innovations in climate solutions. So we need more kind of risk takers, which could be the government, to help with the first stages of technical assistance of developing new ideas and so on, right? And so that kind of financing then will be combined with the private sector funding so that they can feel more confident to come in. So all of this is now being called blended finance. A lot of insurance actors are now looking at the space. I think like even large insurance companies and reinsurance companies, they feel that their business model is really being threatened by climate change, right? Because floods that used to happen every 30 years now have a chance of happening more frequently than 30 years. Some maybe it can happen like every 2 years now. So disaster risk insurance is much more costly for the insurers to insure. So insurance is actually a sector that has real interest in understanding climate change scenarios and coming up with new products to help their own business model, but also to better address the needs of people as well. And of course, we all know about public-private partnerships. There are many donors out there who also do a lot of technical assistance because one of the first things that we need to understand when we think about climate finance needs is, well, how much risk, right, or how much impact am I going to get from climate change? And so we need to think through climate hazards. How am I going to be affected by like health or like rising heat, or the water, is there going to be water risk of flooding, drought? So all of this is climate risk. So we need to be able to do climate risk assessments. And so there's, I think, a lot of ongoing technical assistance for this, including at the community level in Thailand also. A lot of capacity building training. And of course, we cannot ignore the policies and regulation and fiscal incentives, right? So like, for example, as I mentioned earlier, if governments start to reduce the fossil subsidies, clearly that's unlocking, the capital needed for low carbon and climate action activities. So we don't have, so instead of thinking like, okay, wow, we need so much money, where we're going to find money for that, right? So one answer is, well, where the money is helping or supporting high carbon or climate, high climate risk activities, those are the potential. If we can unlock it, then that answers both questions. So we can reduce the high risk activities and also put money into climate action. So I think this is something that's quite necessary. And things like carbon taxes, for example, the ETS, mandatory carbon accounting, all of this will help to send the right signal to the private sector to basically improve their climate action activities, because it will make high carbon activities more expensive, high emission activities more expensive. So I think this is one thing that we can all push for. I think fossil subsidies, high carbon subsidies exist more or less everywhere in the world. Okay, so there are many different kinds of structuring blended finance. I don't want to go too much into detail, but this is just some examples of how you can combine guarantees with debt, with equity. You can combine grants with equity, with debt. And so I think this is a role of intermediaries or people who structure climate finance. So let's say, if they are looking at projects alone, right? So let's say a foundation thinking through the project, they may find some difficulty or some limitation. The government may find some limitation. The private banks may find some limitation. But if we can find a way to bring them together, as a group, then maybe we can structure some blended finance way to address everybody's risk appetite and encourage them to invest and give them enough assurances. So this is just an example of catalytic funding, the way they think through it. So I take this from the USAID, which is a US agency. And I just heard yesterday President Trump said he will stop all aid to foreign countries. So we don't know how USAID is going to operate now. So I think that is an interesting development. But anyway, so catalytic funding, again, as I mentioned, it tends to be government-backed private funds because they can absorb more risk than the private sector. They go in to help with like startup costs or the operating expenses, essentially whatever is necessary to mobilize or to incentivize the private sector to come in. So this kind of funding, they don't want to replace the private sector, but they want to just kind of be the first step, right? Provide just enough money and enough instruments and facility to attract more private sector to follow, right? And they usually have some development goals, development impacts they want to achieve as well. So they're not in it for financial returns. So this is just an example of a catalytic fund. This is quite famous because it was launched by the UAE, the host of COP28. And so they announced it, a very big fanfare. They said that, they want to push it up to 200 billion US dollars by 2030. So this is you can go into their website and study, but this is what they claim, right? The world's largest private climate investment fund, but basically backed by the United Arab Emirates government. And Singapore, as I mentioned, is doing some interesting things. Singapore now has what they call transition credits. It's a specialized form of carbon credit that is meant to help transition coal-fired power plant. So basically, it's essentially the carbon credit used to finance the early retirement of coal-fired power plants. So right now, this is another thing they just announced. So they already commit. So last year at COP29, they said they want to commit 500 million US to structure a blended finance alongside with ADB and other parties. And they call this program Financing Asia's Transition Partnership, so FAST-P. So they want to assist in decarbonizing the region. So this is still new. So they want to operationalize it, I think, this year or next year. And then in terms of government, a lot of interesting examples, like the government at Luxembourg has a whole suite of different climate finance platforms and different kind of funds with different time horizons and interest and different. So basically they want to say we have different mechanisms where the private sector can join in climate finance. And then in terms of bundling, so one difficulty I mentioned, right, was in how to, if some promising project, like you have a climate adaptation project, but the ticket size is small, and how do we access like bigger funds? So one way is to bundle them and combine different promising projects into a bigger chunk. And on the funding side, they can also combine their resources and pool their knowledge into financing specific kinds of projects. So this is an interesting fund called the Global Fund for Coral Reefs. So they have both the equity fund and the grant-based fund. So all of this will have to be basically funding the restoration of coral reefs around the world. Also get some financing from the Green Climate Fund too. So as you can see, there are many different ideas being tried at the moment. But I want to end with just saying that transition must be a just transition, right? Because if it's not a just transition, or if we lose this principle of climate justice along the way, we risk that the financing will go to the people who should not be helped because they're already well-to-do or already well-off, for example. So I think the concept of climate justice is important, and it should be centered in every kind of climate finance transactions or structuring. In Thailand at CFNT, we are also involved with energy transition quite a bit with our ongoing research. So we want to say that there is a way for, Thailand has to do energy transition, but without the justice component, without the just energy transition, maybe we'll end up with, basically a handful of the same companies. They just switch from fossil to renewable energy. And that's not what we want, because we see that renewable energy has a huge potential to help people with decentralized power. People can have energy security at the community level, at the individual level. And we think that that's a way to a fairer kind of low carbon economy. So we try to promote the idea of just energy transition, not only transition alone is not enough. So I want to end here and take a Q&A from the audience. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Sarinee, for the insightful presentation. I know participants couldn't wait to ask you some questions because I am. Okay, so we're now in the Q&A session. If you want to ask some questions, just type in the Q&A box. But if you prefer to ask directly, you could raise your hand and just ask the question straight away. Anyone? Okay. Okay, while waiting, maybe I would start asking you some questions. So I'm really into the concept of the role of intermediary actors and civil society in climate finance. I mean, you already told us about that before, but I'm still in the process of knowing what kind of roles that we, especially here in Rujak, but also maybe other friends that working also with communities, that we can what sort of things that we can do to improve the kind of funding that the communities, especially marginalized community, can access, because most of the time we only rely on public funding from the government. I know we have some potential with the private finance and financing, but most of the time, I know that the kind of fund that goes into communities are the kind of funds that goes into nature-based solutions. So particularly for communities in forest areas or in mangrove areas, just like most of them are mitigation projects, right? But here in the cities, you can access that because, like cities. So maybe you could give some insight into that. Yeah.
Thank you, Ka. Thank you, Ka. I think this is really, sorry, I forgot to say at the beginning that we work quite closely with civil society organizations in our work. We see them as a very important stakeholders in everything we do. So I'm really glad to have a chance to share with the Indonesian colleagues, right? So I think that civil society actors have actually very important roles to play in in the, I call it meaningful climate finance, right? So, climate finance that really lead to real action and impacts, right, on the ground. So I just want to use this slide because I think that, so you see here, there are 4 boxes. So from the first box, you see source of climate finance. So I think the civil society organization, CSOs, can think in terms of, what might be potential actors, right, in your region. It could be local government also, but sources in this sense, I think that it could also start from trying to calculate and make a clear story on the impacts of climate change on the ground. Because why I say that? Because, like, for example, you may not before think of local government, or local companies as potential funders. But if you already have done some work on the impacts of climate change, and you can go to them and say, hey, look, if the problem continues, this is what's going to happen to the people. And the government may have to spend more local budget to address the problem, right? And this is how the local companies will be affected, because maybe your workers cannot go to work, or maybe they'll have like health problems and so on. So I think that what I say about more systematically assess the potential impacts, and this kind of projection can help identify sources of climate finance that maybe you didn't think of before, because it could be a way to start the dialogue, right? Because that's kind of their, I mean, it should, I think people's incentive can be how do you say, like, activated when they see how it relates to them. So I think that's the first thing. In terms of intermediary agencies, I think that CSOs are very in a very good position to, for example, combine the interesting or potential project that I mentioned. Maybe of, let's say, like different communities, right, that are already doing some very interesting things that can help with the climate adaptation, but maybe they don't know each other. So I think this is one way you can make it in finance term. This is called making the project investment ready, right? So you can kind of combine them and then see, hey, we actually may have something interesting here, because it can work not only in one community but in different communities. So I think CSO can play this role of being intermediary in that sense as well. For insurance, maybe that's a bit more difficult, because CSOs by nature, you guys are not finance experts. Otherwise, you'll be in finance, right? But I think for the last box, the allocation and uses of fund, I think here, very important role in CSO for CSOs for MRV, right? So for example, just go back to my I guess description of green bond. So one of the big challenge of green bond is the greenwashing, because now every company, they don't want to issue normal bond anymore. They want to say, okay, green bond, because it's like good for the image, and sometimes they get better interest. But investors will ask question, well, okay, how do we know if your investment is really green? Do you really put it in green project? And I think today's age, the word green has to also mean socially responsible, you know. You know what I mean? Like in Thailand, we try to campaign quite a lot on like big dams in the Mekong River, because we say, hey, okay, big dams, they claim to be very low carbon. So they claim renewable energy. And we say, well, just because you are low carbon doesn't mean you're green. If you are causing impacts on the ecosystems, if you like have to force thousands of people to move, that's not green, that's not responsible. That's why we try to promote this word responsible renewable energy. But so I think that CSOs have direct role, really. I mean, if you want it, you can really trace the so-called green bond proceeds, and you can go and see whether those projects are green or not, whether they cause problem with the community or not. And I think overall investors will appreciate that, right? Because I think we need better MRV, we need more quality kind of green instrument, just like we need higher quality carbon credits. Yeah, so I would say I think three of these mechanisms, three of these boxes, very big role for CSOs to play.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer.
Thank you. I noticed there start to be some questions, so I'm gonna take them in the
Yeah,
chat.
go
Okay,
ahead.
so the first person asked about socially responsible RE. So I think that so I think this relates to what I said earlier about like the example of dams, right? So, but I think more interestingly, if you look at the kind of very high green standard nowadays. So for example, if you look up the Climate Bonds Initiative, CBI, they have this thing called Climate Bond Standard, right? And if you go read their standard, it's actually quite interesting. In order to meet the Climate Bond Standard, it's not enough for the project to have low carbon emission. It also has to pass a whole series of socially responsible mechanisms. Like the project have to, report that it's like basically did a dialogue with the stakeholders under the FPIC, free prior informed consent, and it's done some like social assessment, for example. So that's why I say this is a time where the green and the social standards are kind of coming together. So I would say that yes, in general, I mean, in Thailand, we try to say for anything to be called themselves green, it's not enough to look at climate profile. It's not enough to claim on emissions alone, but it has to be like more comprehensive. ค่ะ okay คุณ Farah asked how to initiate climate financing for private sector if they never have any history of financing green projects. Yeah, well, I think that in Indonesia, I think maybe it's difficult, maybe because you are still a very big coal producing and exporting country, right? So it's kind of maybe difficult to transition away in that sense. That's why the concept of just transition is important, right? You don't want, I mean, I don't think Indonesians want tomorrow for all the coal mines to shut down and all the workers out of job, with no, I don't think that's a just transition. And so I think that, so anyway, going back to renewable project, I think that renewable by itself has a very high potential, because in Thailand, we see that the cost of solar keeps coming down quite a lot, especially from China. we have the, flood of solar panels, cheap solar panels from China, for example. So I think the renewable itself is quite competitive now compared to fossil projects. So I think it's just a matter of maybe finding the right scale and the right project to put in front of the banks. Because so what I mean is like for Thai banks now, the reason they finance solar project now is not so much about like, okay, trying to help the earth, right? But they see that there are some very clear financial returns. So I think if it passes at this level, I think it should be viable for you to put it in front of the banks. And I think there are many different examples of banks in the region that finance renewable energy projects. And it's just a matter of whether Indonesian banks want to be part of that. Is the idea. Okay, another question, is it possible that private sector is hesitant due to local government policies? It's possible also. I think in Thailand we also have. I don't know about Indonesia, but in Thailand, many of our big companies don't feel like they need to move so much on climate adaptation because they get a lot of support and subsidies from the government. So I think that's a real obstacle to change. But that's why I think that's more of the reason why if you want them to change in Thailand, we say that you need to draw the picture of hell, So we have to say like, okay, maybe you feel like you're okay now, right? But look, 10 years or even 5 years from now, if this continues, you're gonna be in big trouble. And so I think this is one thing we can all try to do, to paint the picture of hell more clearly. So that private sector say that, okay, we have to change. In Thailand, we also try to use the story of competitiveness also. Like, for example, in Vietnam, which is really catching up to Thailand, right? They have a lot of low carbon, very fast growth of low carbon industries already that are even in agriculture they start to sell like low carbon rice, for example, and so that that means the Thai like agriculture firms start to notice and say, hey, okay, wow, low carbon rice, if it can sell at a premium price, why don't we develop that? So I think this idea of combining the need for climate finance with competitiveness or maintaining competitiveness, reducing and remember reducing damages is also a part of the reason to maintain. It's a way to maintain competitiveness, right, of the country. So I think these stories we can try to make it more clear to the government and private sector. That's our idea anyway. What are the incentives for private sector in financing green projects? I think that so there are different kinds of incentive. I would say, just summarizing myself a little bit, the most immediate and the easiest, I would say, incentive is if they see some financial returns from green investment. So for example, like in Thailand, it's quite easy now to do like energy efficiency projects, some solar financing for industry, some like, for example, waste management, like methane capture from waste disposal, and then the companies will go and sell for carbon credit, for example. So all of that, I think you can calculate financial returns. And so that becomes, I mean, some of the easier things to finance. But yeah, I agree with you that incentive from the government is very important. So I'm sure in Thailand, for example, as soon as the government imposes a carbon tax on high carbon activity, immediately that's going to change the people's incentives to invest in green. So green will become more attractive, right? But anyway, that's not happening yet. But I think that we cannot ignore the government. I mean, they do need to have the right incentives and push for more green projects. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarinee, for the answers. I think it's very insightful. I learned a lot today, especially from the private sector,
Yeah.
because just as you said, we're not, I mean, personally, I am not familiar with those kind of instruments and other topics. And I would give some times for the participants if you want to ask another questions to Sarini. We still have some time.
And my slides you can distribute. I think it's okay.
Yeah. Okay.
No problem. No secrets, I think.
Okay. Uh, I think maybe I would want to close the session by asking the last question, if that's okay. I mean, I'm kind of interested because from the last question, the participant asked about the role of governments, right? And just like you said, here in Indonesia, especially if we're talking about energy transition, there's a big barrier because of our country's position towards the coal, right? And do you care to give some insights or maybe your stories working with governments and or other uh, NGOs or think tanks in Thailand or around the world, especially when they're working with the government to make some incentives or make some programs that promote some investment, especially toward green economies. Because here in Indonesia, I don't think that we have that robustness in terms of programs. So yeah, maybe you care to
Thank you ค่ะคุณซากิ I'm not sure if I can add any more to what I already said, but I think that one lever. So unfortunately, I think for us, governments maybe in Thailand, Indonesia, and other countries also tend to listen more to the business sector, right, than than their people and the CSOs. So in Thailand, whenever we want to say something or propose something to the government, we try to, at least for some of the work we do, we try to convince the private sector first that if you don't do this, you're going to lose competitiveness, you know, vis-a-vis other countries that better adapt to climate change than Thailand. And we also use just the fact that Thailand is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change already. And we already, like last year in Thailand, there was a very big floods in many areas of the country, and it's clear that government was very hard pressed because the government budget was very small to begin with, and then they have to quickly find some emergency funds to finance the disaster compensation basically. So we say, well, we have to better plan it now because we know that it's gonna likely happen more, right? And like more severe damage. So this is one rationale to better plan climate adaptation process, and maybe you can also access international funding like the loss and damages fund, right? So I think that this is kind of the government, if they see that, okay, maybe this is a way for them to better use their budget and reduce the burden. This is one. So I say one idea is to try to connect with the government's budget as much as you can, and the kind of the how much more effective they can be, right? Another way is competitiveness. I think is always top of the government's mind. So I think this is a lot of work to be done. Also, people's incentives. For example, in Australia, this is an example that I think is interesting because it may resonate with Indonesia because Australia is also a big coal country, right? And I think that there are several CSOs in Australia that are doing something very interesting. Like they have a coalition between the labor unions, so basically the labor activists and the environmentalists, and they basically now join hands because the environmentalists was able to convince the labor unions that sooner or later Australia has to phase out coal, you know, and if the government is not prepared today, then potentially workers in the mines, in the coal plants will be hurt, right? They'll be left with like no jobs. And so it's in their interest to manage this transition by proposing a just transition to the government. So in Australia, we now see examples of like these coalitions, proposing on their own to the government that, okay, we need to get ahead of the curve. We need to transition away from coal, but this is what the government needs to do to protect the workers. So they propose things like, the reskilling programs, upskilling programs, various kinds of government assistance. And I think all of this could be done in Indonesia also. And I see that Indonesia is also part of the JETP, right? The Just Energy Transition Partnership, which of course I heard has a lot of problems. But I think in a way it's an opportunity, because like in Thailand, we don't even have that, right? So like we don't have any kind of international energy transition mechanisms. So I think you might as well use this opportunity to put forward a kind of just transition plan that protects the workers. So I think that, yeah, I think there should be opportunities we can exploit, yeah, in talking about this. But at the end of the day, it's about protecting the economy. It's about improving competitiveness. It's about reducing burden of government, kind of all the things that maybe is not in our interest, but it's in their interest, and it gets to the same goal. So, yeah.
Thank you, Sarinee. I think from what you've said, I think it is very important to engage with different sectors, with different stakeholders, not
Yeah.
only for the government, not only to the private sectors, even to the labor's unions, even
Right.
the communities, right? Okay, so with Sarine's answer, we've come to the end of our class. I'm very confident that the participants learn a lot from you today, Sarine. And once again, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you,
Although,
everyone. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. And I wish you all the best of luck in your work. I think you're doing very important work. I think, and if anyone is interested in what we do at CFNT, feel free to visit our website and download our reports and even become our members. Thank you.
okay, I'll do.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I hope the participants through today's class learn a lot from you, to borrow from your word, to be a catalyst for better in climate finance in the future. To our participants, thank you for your active engagement today. We hope you found this session informative. And our next session, which is in Thursday, we're going to talk a lot about climate finance governance in Indonesia. Next Thursday, 30 January, at the same time, 5 p.m. And we'll be exploring exciting topics like the current climate finance landscape and governance in Indonesia. Okay, before closing the class, the recording of this class and today materials will be shared with you, just like in the last session. And see you. We look forward to seeing you in Thursday. Bye-bye.